All right, I do see the number of participants stabilizing, so I think we may want to kick us off to this hour of webinar, Overshooting the latest science on the risks and actions needed. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for this big interest into our webinar. My name is Karl-Friedrich Schleusner. I'm the lead of the EU Horizon 2020 project Provide. And we're going to present to you today some of our latest scientific insights on precisely that topic, presented to you by some of our experts from the consortium, Sabine, Joeri, Rogelj, and Benjamin Sanderson. We will kick you off with an overview on the latest science, and then we are very excited to have some reflections, first from Kaisa Kosonen, yes. From Greenpeace International, who's also on the scientific advisory board or stakeholder advisory board of our project, and from Philippe Tulkens, the head of Unit Climate and Planetary Boundaries and the Research and Innovation Director General of the European Commission. So from the European Commission, one of our funders of our project, providing a reflection, and I could hear Philippe just speaking up, so it seems we are all on board and ready to go. So with not much further ado, I just want to highlight why we are doing this. The project Provide is specifically focusing on that question. So we are looking into questions of overshooting risks over the Paris Agreement, questions of reversibility, climate impacts, and also the dimensions of adaptation. Without much further ado, I want to hand over to our first speaker, Rogelj, and Joeri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Al. And also, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. In the few opening reflections that I can provide, I want to focus on our current, what I would call overconfidence in overshoot. And I hope that by the end of my 5 minutes, it will be clear in which dimensions I think we are currently overconfident. Let's start from the very beginning, and that is the situation where we are at, and that is that we currently have a very bleak picture of where global warming is heading, and there is a relatively low chance that, given the current NDCs that are currently on the table, warming will be limited below 1.5 or even 2 degrees. Here you can see some visuals from a recent paper. On the left-hand side, you can see emissions pathways of 2 extreme cases. One where we take the pledges, the NDCs until 2030, and we project them out into the future. That is the higher case. And then on the lower end, you can see a case where we, in addition to all the pledges in 2030, we also assume all the long-term net zero targets. So this is kind of the range of what we are working with today. The highest end of this range leads to warming by the end of the century well beyond 2 degrees. The lower end of this leads to warming beyond 1.5, although it could be below 2 degrees. So you might think, oh, we have actually done most of the job. We are close to limiting warming well below 2 degrees. And however, not all of these long-term net zero targets are equally credible. And in this study, what we did here is we attached a credibility score to the long-term net zero targets. And without going into detail of all the cases here, if we only take those net zero targets that we assign a higher confidence of being implemented, and we assign them confidence based on whether they are legally binding, whether they have a credible plan for implementation, and whether countries are actually already on a downward path, reducing their emissions towards net zero. And if we only take those targets into account, then you can see that even with those long-term targets, we are still far from limiting warming to 2 degrees. That would be the case here on this figure, with warming by the end of the century beyond 2 degrees and continuing thereafter. So let us be clear from the start, we are not on track, and climate ambition, climate emission reductions need to be strengthened urgently. So it is clear that under current pledges, we are heading towards exceeding the limits that we have set in the Paris Agreement. But scientifically, there will be a very long period of gray before science will have high confidence that 1.5 will or has been crossed. And there are two dimensions of this gray space. The first is to actually know the exact global warming, and that you can see here on the left-hand side. That is a screenshot from the climate change tracker website, where also members of the Provide consortium provided input to, where you can see at the bottom, you can see the global temperatures and also the human-induced share of that. Now you can see that the best estimate is currently at 1.25 degrees, 1.26, but the uncertainties around that estimate are 1.6. So in a way, today we could already have committed more than 1.5 degrees of warming, but we could also be well underneath it. That uncertainty won't be reduced in the future. On the right-hand side, you can then see an illustration of the uncertainty going forward. And that uncertainty is twofold. First of all, with how many emissions we are going to emit, will we reduce emissions strongly, or will we continue to increase them? And how the climate responds to those emissions. And the combination of those two uncertainty means that there will be a long period of gray before we will have high confidence that 1.5 has been crossed. And that really means that there is no clear cutoff time when we can say in an easy and straightforward way that we have reached 1.5 and that we are now clearly beyond it. Finally, not being on track has a few implications. First of all, I want to highlight, and one of those is that one is considering overshoot pathways. Overshoot pathways are pathways that first fail to limit warming below a certain temperature threshold and then afterwards try to catch up. And in those pathways, we use carbon dioxide removal to as part of the mitigation portfolio. Now, carbon dioxide removal can perform three main tasks in large-scale mitigation portfolios. The first task is to accelerate net reductions in the near term in combination with very stringent reductions in emissions, and that would help us limit the maximum warming to as low levels as possible. Then carbon dioxide removal also helps us with achieving net zero, which is necessary to stop warming from further increasing. And finally, if carbon dioxide removal is further scaled up, we can also achieve net negative CO2 emissions, and that will lead to a slow reversal of global warming. Now, while we know the general understanding and the general physics of what I have just described, there's quite a bit of overconfidence when we apply that in the context of an overshoot. And that overconfidence is in two dimensions. First, I see an overconfidence in the technologies that are required to achieve an overshoot. For an overshoot, we need to achieve net negative CO2 emissions. That means that at some point we are betting that we will be removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than we are still emitting into it. That requires two things. One, that we are effective in scaling up technologies, and two, that carbon dioxide removal measures actually deliver the removal that we think that we are currently planning for. In particular, with nature-based solutions or land-based solutions, that might not be the case. So these are two dimensions of technological overconfidence in how we will be achieving a overshoot. The second dimension is a geophysical one. Very often when we look at overshoot pathways, we just consider the median behavior of what we know is physically possible. If we look at geophysical uncertainties, we know that overshoot can be much higher than we are currently planning for. And we also know that the reversal or the reduction in temperature after an overshoot can be much harder than just the median average behavior that we are currently planning for. So that is why I would think it is a much more cautious approach to not think about overshoot, which is to aim which is basically considering aiming to fail and then hoping for the best, but rather to think about these pathways or mitigation in terms of a peak and decline, where we first focus on minimizing the damages by keeping peak warming as low as we possibly can, and then afterwards considering returning to safer pastures by achieving the sustainable levels of net negative CO2 emissions that we can achieve. And with that, I would like to hand over Sabine Fuss, who will be speaking more on the carbon dioxide removal aspects.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joeri, for setting the scene here in a very excellent way. As Joeri was just saying, I will dive a little bit more deeply into the role of carbon dioxide removal, and brought this stylized pathway that I borrowed from the State of CDR report, where you again see the net CO2 and net GHG emissions that you've already seen in the last slide that Joeri presented. And I wanted to draw your attention to two things mainly, and that is that, as Joeri was saying, CDR is used, especially in the second half of the century, to offset also actually not only the fossil CO2 emissions that are to a minimum still available, but to a large extent also the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions that you see here in pink. Currently, we're mostly looking at land-based removals, but then as time progresses, there's also a phase-in of the more novel CDR methods that would then typically also involve geological storage. Now, as you've also seen in Joeri's presentation already, the scenario space is wide, and we could easily end up having to remove CO2 at in the order of double-digit gigaton levels. So talking something like between 10 and 20 gigatons CO2 in the second half of the century. So this is, of course, a lot. So let's have a look at the potentials. So in the State of CDR report, we also had a look at what recent assessments tell us about the potentials of the different methods to withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere. And if you look at the upper side, the technical potential, you actually see quite decent potentials. You may actually get the impression here that we could actually do that to remove these massive amounts of CO2 with maybe a set of different CDR methods. However, we also actually have to look at the sustainability of this, and also the rollout of different carbon dioxide removal methods will have its own impacts. So in the Provide project, we had a look at the impacts of CDR deployment, and they depend, of course, a lot on the scale. If you want to do everything with one technology, then all of them actually reach their limits at some point in time. So for instance, if you look at the right-hand side on the top, you see afforestation, so plants, trees that would absorb CO2 via photosynthesis. But if you wanted to do everything with afforestation, you would need a lot of land to always plant these additional trees. That might actually be at odds with other sustainability goals, like preserving certain areas of land for biodiversity, might have water constraints, an impact on yields. It will change our landscapes, and can actually, depending on which latitudes we're looking at, also have changes to the albedo that may then offset any gains in temperature decrease. Some impacts are also dependent on how other sectors develop. If you look at the bottom, you see direct air capture. Direct air capture, of course, only makes sense if we have decarbonized the energy sector quickly enough, because you need a lot of carbon-free energy for the carbon balance to work out there. So some impacts are also cross-cutting. The policy response, for instance, there's a worry, for instance, that allowing cheap offsets that are land-based could undermine more expensive mitigation options in the energy sector. There's a worry about efficacy threats, right? If you remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, what does that do with things? Do you have ocean outgassing, these kind of things? And Joeri was already pointing also to the uncertainties around land-based emissions, because here we also have to grapple with the effects of ongoing climate change. We've seen increasingly how disturbances can quickly lead to a reversal. If forests burn, for instance, if bark beetles lead to forest dieback, or also droughts. And there's, of course, also there are also issues around acceptance. So we've screened the literature systematically on expected impacts of CDR deployment. And what we find is that often you do have increasingly knowledge on what it means to scale all of these technologies. However, often these studies are focused on few removal technologies and also on few impacts. So we often see that afforestation, bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, and direct air carbon capture and storage are covered better than others. And also that environmental side effects like water consumption, impacts on air quality or biodiversity due to land use change also have more information. That doesn't mean that there is not also impacts from those other technologies I've been showing you before, but it means that that there's also still a lot of research to be done in order to compose the optimal CDR portfolio. Now, if you look back at the potentials, what I'm showing you here now is the lower end of the potentials ranges that you currently find in the literature. And this is actually just a fraction of what you've previously seen on the upper end. And that's because a lot of those studies take those sustainability constraints into account, environmentally, socially, and so on. And that means that actually our CDR potential that's sustainable may be limited. So if our potential is scarce, what do we actually want to prioritize? And what you see here is a recent paper that also came forth from the project, and you see a very strong correlation between gross CO2 emissions at net zero and the CDR deployment in the middle of the century. So if CDR potentials are limited by sustainability constraints, then reducing gross emissions as much as possible is really key to leave sufficient potential for the temperature decline that Joeri was so evidently making a case for earlier on. In addition, of course, it's wise to rely on a portfolio of CDR options that further reduce the risks to sustainability, but at the same time ensure that we have sufficient potential to tap into for this temperature decline. And what I've already told you before is that we need net negative CO2 emissions to also achieve and sustain net zero GHG emissions in the long run. So I want to close with an illustration of why we actually think this long-term temperature decline is so important, and it's important to prioritize our CDR potentials for that. And what you see here is that a study where one of the results is very evidently that 50 years of overshoot above 1.5 degrees can already commit around 20 centimeters of additional sea level rise by 2300. That's a median estimate, obviously, but that's a lot. So by focusing on net, or by prioritizing net zero GHG peak and decline, a long-term global mean surface temperature trajectory instead of stabilization, or what we previously called net zero CO2, you can reduce the 2300 sea level rise by almost half a meter. And that's a lot. And that's actually, I said it, it's just one example, but ongoing work on other aspects like permafrost melt and peatlands show similar results. So with that example, I want to give over to Ben to tell us more on the SRM part.
Thanks, Sabine. So as Joeri and Sabine have shown already, there is we're both very close to the 1.5 degree threshold, and there's a lot of uncertainty in our potential deployments of carbon dioxide removal. And in the context of this, there's increasing debate about another proposed feature in overshoots of solar radiation modification. And so when we say this, we mean artificial, temporary modification of the albedo, the reflectiveness of the planet. And there's been a number of proposed idealized ways of doing this in the literature. But in the context of today, we're talking about injection of sulfates into the stratosphere from thousands of aircraft every single day, or the brightening of marine clouds by the injection of particles over the ocean into the atmosphere. And so this, needless to say, is a highly controversial proposal. Fundamentally, SRM is not like CDR. So CDR, you are removing the root cause. If you can pull it off, you're removing the root cause of the problem by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. SRM is not doing that. So solar radiation management is masking the temporarily the impacts or some of the impacts of climate change. But the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere remain first order unchanged. And so when we talk about SRM, it's not really cancelling out climate change. It depends on the impact. So if humanity carried this out in the long term, there are some problems which might be masked, like exposure to extreme heat. But it wouldn't reverse the exact pattern of climate change. And so SRM is more efficient at cooling lower latitude areas than higher latitude areas. So and so getting that balance, you can't restore the temperature change that you had in the pre-industrial state. And there's some problems it doesn't address at all, like ocean acidification, which is a function of the carbon dioxide concentrations and not of their radiative effect. And for precipitation, what we see is that SRM plus the background climate change significantly modifies the precipitation patterns which we see. So it's not that we're getting rid of climate change, it's that we're creating an alternative climate change. And what's more, that that combined effect of the two forces of the SRM plus the carbon dioxide is doubly uncertain in terms of getting model consensus in what the outcome could be. And so if we then imagine fast forwarding to a period where this was attempted, and there would be negative impacts, perhaps some regions as illustrated here, perhaps the Amazon would have decreases in net precipitation according to one model's geoengineering studies. So therefore it's quite feasible that there would be regions which would suffer climate impacts directly from the SRM, from the climate change, and at that point it will be quite difficult to disentangle the two. And if at that point it was decided to cease the SRM, we then face a period of incredibly rapid climate change as the system restores rapidly within a period of 1 year or so back to the natural, now unknown climate state. So if we'd been doing this for 50 years, continuously injecting sulfates into the atmosphere while greenhouse gas concentrations continue to accumulate, we would no longer know where the system would return to. So it takes the climate projection problem framed in SRM as in the context of overshoot pathways, and so that's why we're thinking about it in provide. It's proposed in the context of an overshoot where you go over your target temperature for a certain period of time, and then enact negative emissions to get you back down to that temperature. The proposal is that you do a short period of SRM during this period to maintain temperatures at your target, 1.5 degrees, for example.
the issue with this is it assumes that you know a lot of information ahead of time about both how the system will respond to SRM and how and our capacity to perform carbon removal from the atmosphere in the future. And so one of the questions for a study we did in Provide last year was, what if we didn't have perfect foresight? What if there remain significant uncertainties, which are real, about how the system would respond both to the climate forcing and to the SRM forcing? And so what we found was that if we took an ensemble of scenarios which were following current NDCs, and then we assumed that beyond 2100 that there was the capacity for long-term carbon removal, and we sampled our ability to be able to do that using the kind of numbers which Sabine just presented to you, looking at the uncertainty bounds of potential CDR. And what we found is that the timescales associated with a planned short-term deployment of SRM could be multiple centuries, could be up to over 400 years in some of the simulations in our ensemble. And so, and this is even using even if we take optimistic numbers for CDR. So these are the more optimistic numbers from the first table which Sabine presented. If the dice don't rule in our favor and the Earth system doesn't respond in a way which makes it easy to pull down concentrations and temperatures, then we end up with these multi-century commitments, multiple lifetimes worth of commitment to thousands of flights per day, maintaining temperatures at a certain level. And so I think a framing which is becoming increasingly common in the ethical and scientific debate about whether we should even be researching SRM, but certainly thinking about it in the policy space, is a risk framing. So the idea is that we should be comparing the risks of climate change against the risks of enacting SRM. And so what we're arguing in this project is that this framing is oversimplistic, because the two risks are not independent. The world in which we carry out solar radiation management, the underlying climate change is no longer the same. And this is both for physical reasons, because SRM changes the way that the natural carbon cycle behaves. It changes our ability to implement technologies like photovoltaic cells for solar power, and but also it changes politics, because at the moment much of our consensus about the need to mitigate climate change is based on the idea that that in order to reduce our risks in the future, we have to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. So if we break that link by allowing those risks to be indefinitely masked, then we don't know what the outcome of that would be. And so all of these things together mean that we can't consider the risks of SRM and the risks of climate change to be independent. They're intricately coupled and involve processes which we have no capacity yet to model. So that's all I've got to say. So I think we're passing back to Carl to tie us up.
Thank you very much, Joeri, Sabine, and Ben, for these excellent insights from the project. And we're going to hear now from the two reflections from Kaisa and Philippe. Before I give the floor to Kaisa, I just want to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A function to put forward questions to our panelists, all of our panelists. You can either put them to the whole panel or to individual speakers. Some of you are using this quite actively. That is fantastic. And after the two inputs from Kaisa and Philippe, we will turn to those questions and enter the Q&A session. Thank you. Kaisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl, presenters, and thank you, Provide, for the invitation. In light of all the devastation we're already witnessing with current warming, it's clear that we need to do everything to stop this madness, to look at all the options we have. But once you've done that scanning with all the options, the picture is very clear. The clearest and safest path to avoid and limit overshoot and prevent irreversible impacts is a rapid fossil fuel phase out. As the IPCC AR6 says, the higher the 2030 emissions, the higher the overshoot. So right now, we've got to focus on this decade with the tools that we already have and that are proven to work. According to the IPCC, we can halve global emissions by 2030, with the biggest potential seen for solar and wind, electrification, efficiency throughout, and sustainable food systems and ecosystems protection and restoration. CCS is hardly in the picture for this critical decade. The IPCC sees potential for about 1 gigaton by 2030 with high costs, but the actual delivery will be much less. As we all know, CCS has a long history of repeated failures and unmet expectations, despite having been on the oil majors' agenda for decades and enjoying government subsidies. But solar and wind, then again, continue exceeding expectations. Their exponential growth will continue for the rest of this decade. And solar, while already being the cheapest energy source in history, will halve in price again by 2030. And together they can grow even faster than expected right now if we allow them to. But will that be enough? No, if we don't at the same time push fossil fuels out of the way. And definitely not if we don't push them, because we keep on hoping something else will come instead. Techno fixes that some argue would allow us to suck carbon back from the atmosphere in very large quantities, or to reflect some of the sun's rays back into this space. But any researcher that has done any reality checks on this field knows that what works in models and on paper may not work in the real world on a large scale and without uncontrollable collateral damage. Instead, we may end up creating a much bigger mess due to issues related to permanence, biodiversity, and competing demands for land and water and blue water. We have no guarantees that industrial removals can actually be implemented on a large scale, so we definitely shouldn't count on it. So again, let's focus on avoiding and limiting overshoot in the first place. And then on removals, yes, we will need them by now, but let's prioritize what we already have, what works and what brings other benefits too. Reversing deforestation, sustainable reforestation, managing soils to increase carbon levels, and protecting wetlands and to allow them to recover and flourish remain the most cost-effective and currently viable approaches to CDR, relevant to both developed and to developing countries. Can we do without BECCS, DAC, and large-scale industrial plantations? Well, some pathways do still exist in the IPCC literature that do without BECCS, or that substantially limit the need for large-scale removals. And in fact, these are the pathways associated with highest co-benefits and lowest risks. And yes, they entail very rapid reductions in fossil fuel production and use, which is probably why there has been less attention to them in some circles. How about solar radiation modification then? Does it need to be an option on the table? No, because it just isn't an option. It doesn't qualify as an option because it's simply ineffective, unrealistic, and too risky, as Benjamin brilliantly summed up, masking some problems, creating others. So I echo those hundreds of scientists who call for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. It's a big distraction from the things we know we need to do, which is to get the carbon emissions to zero. So we know what to do and we have the money, but the money is heading the wrong way now. Last year, many fossil fuel companies made record profits, but now they are scaling back on their climate ambitions. Nearly all of their investments is still going to the continuation of the old fossil and gas business model. So we can't trust their net zero pledges and their promises on fixing things later, and we can't trust them to manage their own transitions. They need to be mandated to change. So to avoid getting too focused on the speculative and risky stuff, let's acknowledge that we haven't even properly started with the existing options. None of the world's largest fossil fuel producers have committed to ending new investments in oil and gas production and are instead increasing them. Among developed countries, only minor producers have set end dates for oil and gas production. So it's not like we tried everything and it didn't work, so now we need a plan B. It's more like get serious with the plan A and realistic with the plan B. So as Joeri said, peak and decline, minimize damages and return to safer pace thereafter. So to sum up, the best way to avoid and limit 1.5 overshoot is to succeed with this decade, implementing solutions we already have in both emission reductions and removals. And with large-scale CDR, it's speculative, risky, and often not compatible with human rights. So nothing to rely on and everything to put strict sustainability limits for, to come back to Sabine's presentation. So COP28 needs to agree on a 1.5 aligned fossil fuel phase-out and build resilience for the impacts and loss and damages we can no longer avoid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kaisa. Excellent points. Philippe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation first. I'm pleased to be with you here in the very good audience, despite being a Friday evening in Europe. Congratulations to the project Provide and its participants for their dynamism and also for the policy relevance of their activities. With regard to the question of the day, coming from DG Research Innovation, you will not be surprised that I will focus on these aspects and not touch much on the policy of the EU itself, because this is not my direct competence. But as an EC official, of course, I can refer to the line of the Commission. I will start by this on the two issue. With regard to overshoot, there is no specific line because the EU has an objective that is known to all, and we really focus our policy on achieving this objective as much as possible, and all our energy is focused on that. So that is very clear. We don't lose time in diverting from this objective. That is not easy. That is very ambitious, that we are implementing with all the energy we have. With regard to the solar radiation management and geoengineering techniques, I would like to inform those who don't know that there was a recent joint communication between the European External Action Service and the European Commission on climate and security nexus. That came in 2023, and normally if you use your preferred browser, you would find it, and it provides the position of the European Commission and the European Action Service on this issue, and where it's quite clear that we don't invest in technologies in this area. In research, we have no taboo, but we have a limited budget and we have to set priorities. And we focus the research activities on the priorities that we find most relevant to make sure that the EU reaches its climate objective. We focus in the research program on an action related to the governance of climate interventions. There was a call in the work program of 2023 of Horizon Europe, and the grant agreement is about to be signed, and the name of the consortium, the winning consortium, will soon be announced. They will work on this through a coordination and support action, looking at this issue of governance in this area. But there is also a European Research Council project called GENIE, G-E-N-I-E, that you may also find through your preferred browser, that looks into pathways in the context of the European Union. So we are investigating the issue without investing in technologies and to develop those, because those are not amongst our priorities clearly. And I wish to say also here that the European Commission is not related to the activities of the Climate Overshoot Commission, even if the head of Climate Overshoot Commission is Pascal Lamy, former EU EC Commissioner. Probably the name Commission was kept for some reason. He may remember of this good period in the European Commission. But we are not related to their activities. Their report will come out, I think, next week, and we are curious to read it, but we did not participate to these activities. And last element that I wish you to know is that the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission is being consulted on this area. They are currently developing their thinking. It's not exactly the same type of approach as the Climate Overshoot Commission. And their opinion, I don't know exactly when it will be released, but it would be one of the elements taken into consideration in the wide set of views from the scientific communities on this issue that is certainly important, that needs to be investigated, but I repeat, is not a current priority for the implementation of our policies. And I wish to thank Joeri for his presentation, where he, in my view, used the right word, is that in this area, there's a lot of overconfidence. Technological overconfidence, probably overconfidence in the reliability of the models in this area. I'm a former climate modeler, and we know that models are approximations always of the reality, and sometimes very crude approximation, and modesty should also guide the approach of all researchers and policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you again, Kaisa. Thanks for picking up on these points. And I think these were really excellently made. Also, your last point in terms of the modesty on our reflections and on our exchange very strongly resonated with me as well. Thank you to you, our audience, for providing us with a number of questions that we are going forward to address now in the remaining time of this webinar. Feel free to also continue to use the Q&A function. The panel has already started picking up some of your questions. And then we want to start out with a question around the probabilities around NDCs, carbon budgets, and temperature outcomes among different emission pathways. And then also on these emission pathways, the role of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and in particular methane. I will hand over this question to Joeri. And to all panelists, please feel free to also react to each other. And also in particular for the members of the Provide Consortium, feel also free to react to some of the points being made by Kaisa and Philippe in your responses. Thank you. Joeri, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, to the panelists for these reflections. I think they echo very well with the scientific concerns and the scientific insights that we presented earlier. I was asked to answer two questions. The first is on pathways and the likelihood. So basically, in the presentation and the study that I present, we don't use carbon budget as a proxy to estimate what the temperature outcome of these pathways are, but we use simple climate models that are calibrated to represent in the most accurate way the assessment of the climate response and the climate uncertainties of the IPCC. So we basically take the CO2, the methane, and the pathway of all the greenhouse gas emissions over time, and we run them through a simple climate model. And in that, we have the most scientifically most reliable interpretation of what the temperature outcome of these pathways could be. The question, if you are thinking about mitigation pathways and which likelihood to pick for limiting warming below 2 degrees or below 1.5, ultimately that is not a scientific question, as that is a purely societal and probably even an ethical question, what your risk aversions towards failure is. And if the temperature limits that we are considering, 1.5 or 2, are indeed limits not to exceed, then a 50% chance of still exceeding it might be a too high risk to run. And so you would like to be taking carbon budgets that have a larger chance of limiting warming below these limits and therefore are significantly smaller. There were several questions on the role of methane or other short-lived greenhouse gases. Their role is relatively clear. In all pathways that limit warming to the goals of the Paris Agreement, be it well below 2 degrees or 1.5, methane emissions are reduced stringently. So yes, they should be considered, they are considered, and in a way, the important thing to remember here is reducing them doesn't buy us time for CO2, doesn't make the picture rosier compared to what we have already been presenting. On the contrary, if we fail to reduce emissions of methane, either in the fossil extraction or the agricultural sector, we will end up with a smaller carbon budget or with higher warming than we are currently considering in the pathways.
Thank you very much, Joeri. Thanks for providing those insights. I want to turn maybe to Sabine now and some questions that were specifically in relation to CDR. Some of them we've started responding to in writing, but maybe they merit also a bit of a bigger attention. So the first one was a question around the total CCS potential. So if we talk carbon dioxide removal, we also need to ask questions about storage, in particular about direct air capture and carbon capture and storage. There needs to be a question, and there was a reflection around the storage potential that I think would be very useful for us to think about, in particular also in the light of what Ben has been presenting. And then lastly, there was also a question put forward on the basically on the framing of carbon dioxide removal as being part or being unavoidable under certain scenarios, which has led to a strong response in the business sector on some of these technological solutions, and whether or not there is a bit of a misperception happening, and how the panel would feel about the current situation and this focus on this as being a part of the solution, and maybe so it is suggested potentially an overfocus compared to all the caveats that we've been discussing here today. So Sabine, I think we would be very interested to hearing from you about these two questions.
Yes, I think I actually already responded a little bit to CDR questions here and there in the Q&A box, so please go there for more concrete information. But it's of course true that specifically when you look at the large higher end estimates of the potentials that we see for ducks, for instance, the limiting factor that we're really looking at is how much geological storage will be available, how much we will actually be able to scale also the infrastructure that would enable us to transport the CO2, to store it safely there, to monitor it. And that will then, of course, also compete with other customers, because geological storage is also part, for instance, when you combine bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or when we talk about in the shorter term, when we talk about capturing fossil CCS in the industry, that's not reduced quickly enough. So this is definitely a consideration and something to take into account, and which is why then also some of those potentials at the lower end are a little bit more conservative. And yeah, so I think it's not only a question of what's really geologically available, but also how much can be made useful in the short time frames that we're sometimes looking at when scaling these technologies. Now, with respect to Glenn's question on, you see a lot of business interest in CDR, and the IPCC emphasizing also that CDR is almost indispensable right now. Well, I think there's always a lot of media coverage when companies go for CDR, but then if you look at the total volumes, it's actually not that much yet, especially also looking at compared to other activities. But I think it's definitely something that should be on the radar of policymakers, and there are of course ways around that policymakers have influence on. So I think emissions reductions targets, if they remain untouched, it's a strong signal that emissions reductions are prioritized. And then if you have separately targets for carbon dioxide removal, that also sends the strong message that you cannot exchange one for the other and sort of like greenwash your ongoing emissions with removals. So careful consideration. It needs to be given also what you can in the end what you can in the end offset, or what you need to prioritize with what. And here science is needed to underpin also what policymakers come up with. But I think a first step into the right direction would actually be to separate the two emissions reductions and carbon removal on the other hand, so that that there's not the perception created that you can trade one thing off for the other easily.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I'm now looking if anyone else of our panelists wants to share perspectives on this. Maybe Kaisa, since this was also basically going beyond the mere realm of science and touched on some of the reflections that you shared with us as well. Maybe you have a perspective on this particular point to share with us too.
Thank you, Glenn. I think I'm also looking at your last question. Has the research community put so much focus on CDR, overshoot, etc., that the business community now thinks the best thing they can do to climate is to invest in CDR or DAX? How do we address this? I think it's an excellent question. I'm not sure I would blame the scientists. Kind of, in a way, I had to, even when I was preparing for this panel, I had to Google when was it that the IPCC published a special report on carbon capture and storage. It was almost 20 years ago. So I feel like that's when we already there was this one wave of hype. But despite all this discussion then, how little has actually happened in that world of CCS since then. So I think the research that has come after that with the 1.5 special report, and then the research that followed, but that put more sort of emphasis on the sustainability limits of CDR and especially of BECCS and all that, it is making the picture more clear, at least for us who are following it more closely. And I think where indeed like clarification is still needed is on sort of the sequencing and the timelines. What is it that we absolutely need for what period? And especially now that we have to focus on this critical decade, now let's put all our eggs on like minimizing the need for the CDR, minimizing the overshoot, getting those fossil fuel emissions down. But of course, then also when we look at the rest of it, the CDR, then be as realistic as possible so that we no longer kind of pretend that something is happening at some point, but nobody doing anything that would, suggest it's actually happening. So I'm not sure whether that answered to your question, but yes, I think there is still room and need for specifying, like Sabine said, what is it that we actually need to prioritize right now.
Thank you very much, Kaisa. Looking to you, Philippe, if you also had some thoughts to share on this particular point, or anyone else from the panelists.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, to react about the curiosity of the researchers, I think it's just normal that researchers look at all kinds of options, even some that are very fancy. That's part of the development of knowledge, and then they have to see the pros and the cons for everything. Of course, business looks at opportunities, and no one should blame them for that. But it's the role of policymakers to make sure that the business opportunities also serve the societal challenges and the priorities in these societal challenges. This is what we try to do. And therefore, I think we are currently operating in a safe space by not being blind to developments that others may do, looking at the governance, at the possible consequences of new technologies in these areas, and explore the options of CDR that are workable and compatible with all our other environmental objectives. So we try to do this in a sound way, and we count on the researcher to guide us in a very balanced way in this direction.
Thank you very much, Philippe. This is also really interesting to hear the reflections on this question from your side, and also the role that science can play and should play in your view in informing your decision making. I know Joeri wants to have a short reflection, but I already want to put another question to Joeri and then maybe Ben to follow up on, which is around scenarios to more explicitly explore questions and scientific questions around overshoot and what should be our focus there, and what could be and should be done in terms of a scientific and research agenda going forward. So maybe Joeri, a short reflection, and then over to you, Ben.
Yeah, first a short reflection on whether the scientific community kind of is responsible for kind of setting the wrong emphasis in with researching and focusing on CDR. To be honest, I think every researcher is excited about what they research, and if they find something new, they shout about it, and then it's the media who amplifies selectively from what research shout. And it's not just CDR tends to be picked up a lot, but there are many other things that are not being picked up, unfortunately. Think about efficiency or demand side measures, which are aspects that are researched a lot, that we understand very well, but that are not really picked up. And I think, well, it's just a question of which story is most media savvy, and unfortunately CDR is very desirable for journalists. On the scenarios that are required or that we can use to understand near-term futures, actually the near term is in terms of scenario terms relatively easy to model, and that means that the near term is to a very large degree already determined by what we have emitted until today. So even if we consider a very high continuation or a strong departure from current trends, the next 5 to 10 years won't yet see a very large difference in temperature or climate projections. This departure from trends is, however, extremely important to slowly make the ship turn towards a lower carbon, lower climate future. And so it's only it's not until 3, 4, 5 decades in the future that the real difference, the absolute difference in scenarios becomes visible. But I want to hand over to Ben, who maybe can add some further reflections on this.
Yeah, thanks, Joeri. I mean, I guess I'll continue on from the same thread and then bring it back to scenarios. But in terms of the danger that scientists over focus on CDR, I think we have to think here that there's more than one community of scientists, and whereas some economic models may prefer CDR as an easy solution to climate change, arguably the physical modeling community haven't engaged with this question enough of how to put real process understanding in how CDR would function in the context of coupled Earth system processes. And this is realized, and this is in a community-wide conversation about what scenarios should look like as we seek to inform the next decade of mitigation in the IPCC. There's a lot of questions about what scenarios need to do. Firstly, there's an assessment of where we are now in terms of what strategies for meeting the Paris targets are still on the table. What do they look like? And also, can we frame questions which are useful for informing near-term differences in mitigation ambition? So what are the consequences of a decade delay in action? Our scenario space needs to be able to capture this kind of question, but also in terms of the question referred to the potential ecosystem feedbacks which we might encounter if we overshoot the Paris targets. And so part of this question is a reassessment of what is our upper end, what is our worst case scenario. And that's an active research question. So extrapolating what current policies are and what the likelihood is you know, in a worst case scenario that we fail to achieve some of those some of those policies, where do you end up? Is for an adaptation perspective something which we need to get a handle on in order to properly quantify the risks of failing to act in the near term. And so, so part of this is about thinking about how our models are wired together. At the moment, we have models which we run on supercomputers of the entire Earth system, and we tend to run scenarios where we are assuming a concentration pathway. One of the challenges going towards the next phase of the IPCC is whether we can reframe these scenarios in terms of activity, in terms of changes in fossil fuel emissions, in terms of the implementation of different types of CDR strategies, in terms of our strategies with land use management. And if we can get these decisions into the domain of complex process models, then we can begin to put better error bars on the outcomes and the risks associated with different strategies, associated with CDR, associated with reliance on afforestation, this kind of thing. So we can definitely build more informative scenarios going forward, and that's, yeah, I think that's broadly what the community is trying to do right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben. I have one last point to advertise on the question of scenarios that under Provide. We've created a set of overshoot scenarios that we are systematically exploring also until the year 2300. And we make the results available on our Provide climate risk dashboard, where you can explore yourself the implications of overshoot in different locations. Some of these questions are being explored there. Obviously, wider efforts are required, but we are trying to address and spearhead this point. So please, if you're interested in our work, consider following us in a range of different platforms, and maybe also our website and newsletter. We will keep you very closely informed. With that, it's 2 minutes past the hour on what is in Europe a Friday evening, and I want to invite you all to join me with a round of applause for our panelists and speakers. Thank you very much for your time, very much appreciated in these very enriching discussions. There are a lot more questions also in the chat. We hope to follow up with many of you then also via email. Feel free to also reach out to the consortium or individual speakers if you have follow-up questions. And of course, we will be in the position to share our slides, hopefully with those of you who are interested. With that, I bring that webinar to a close. I want to thank you all for your interest and hope to see you at any next event that the consortium might organize. Have a great afternoon and evening to all of you, and a very good weekend. Thank you.